This is the first Sunday of Advent, the 4 weeks of Advent where we prepare and look forward to the birth of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. So I'd like to show you a Bible translation. So at the same time, Robin's going to try to show the screen that Abigail does. And this is an ASL version of the Bible that's Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Okay, fine. Tell me when. Yeah? When?
Ready? Nothing. Ready? 1, 2, 3, click.
Oh, oops. Mine's a 3-part process. Sorry.
Sorry.
That's
Wait,
okay.
Abigail, go back.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so wait. 1, 2, 3, click.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Oh. We have to continue to 17.
all those names? Names upon names upon names. But verse 17, the final verse says, I told Abigail and Rob to stop, but it says, therefore, 14 generations from Abraham to King David. 14 generations from King David to the exile in Babylon. Then 14 generations from Babylon to the birth of the Messiah. So there were 3 series of 14 generations, and there were so many names listed in that genealogy. You know, today a lot of people love to research their family trees, right? They really delve into it. It can be fascinating. You know, there's Ancestry.com and 23andMe, and there's millions of people who are now registered in those 2 services, and I don't know if there's any other than them. I have done both, but I was really surprised that they both were not, they didn't really explain very much in depth. For example, they can't tell you, they really can't find the dominant genes that lead to disease or, you know, why people are deaf. They can't find that through Ancestry or 23andMe. They don't get that deep. They just match people who have the same DNA markers. So it's a little bit of a guessing game still. It's not really 100% accurate by any means, but it's still fun. So it's really fun to check in and just see what they say. You know, some of the advertisements, there's one guy who said, I thought I was German. I always danced in lederhosen. And then we did 23andMe and found out I'm Scottish, so now I dance in a kilt. I thought that was a pretty funny advertisement. You know, it can be surprising what you find. He always thought he was German, but nope, he was Scottish. You know, teaching in universities, we find lots of things that we can delve into. Some of my students were related to George Washington. Some were actually descendants of Abraham Lincoln. There was a couple that were related to Rosa Parks, you know, that famous woman who refused to give up her seat, moved to the back of the bus. So when they delved into their past, they found that they were in that lineage. Some of them even found out who their families were in Africa before the slave ships came and they were coerced into slavery. And you know, it was hard to, and those can be really hard to find because you know, black people aren't really named McIntosh or Davis. Those are not African names. Those are the names of their slave holders. So to find their authentic family names from Africa is really hard, but it's really fascinating. And it also just feels, and it gives them such a sense of belonging to find their roots. And there can be shocking details that have come when we start to delve into our past. Maybe we have some slave owners or thieves in our lineage. Sometimes we have famous inventors in our lineage that we don't know about. You can discover things you have no idea about or members of your family. There are some really interesting facts that we can discover. You know, we can also find that we have something in our family tree that is really different than any of us. And that can be kind of astounding too. And what that means is that people in our families are not all perfect. Does anybody have a perfect family anywhere? No. If you know nobody of you had better say yes. And you Zoom folks, I can't see us, you better not say yes. But nobody here in physical presence said yes. And in Jesus' genealogy, his family tree is a mess. A mess. It was very messy. You know, and I was surprised that Matthew went ahead and just wrote this all out. He didn't hold anything confidential. He hid nothing. There were no secrets. He named everybody. And I'm so very glad that Matthew decided to include everyone. that he did not hide or omit any one person from that list. That was so good to see. Because, when you think about Jesus' family tree and our own family trees, some of the names look like they would be really hard to say, right? I mean, when we were standing there, I was trying to figure out how to say them because they're so long, they can be hard. Some of the names we're familiar with, like Ruth, Jacob, Isaac, yay, my two, Abraham, Judah, Jesse, Solomon, King David. We're familiar with those names. But most of the names, when we were reading through them, we maybe didn't read real carefully because we don't know how to relate to them. We don't know how to say them. We don't know how to pronounce them. So, Matthew did record them. Because in the first century, Jewish people did know all of those names. Jewish tradition was replete with oral history, which means the stories have been passed down of each and every one of those people. So all of the Jewish children grow up listening to these stories. And they knew the stories about each of those people that were named. Those have been passed down to every generation without fail. Because they thought it was very important that they learned about the exile, that the children learned about the war, that they learned their history, that they learned about all the challenges that the Jewish people had faced and overcame. It was critical for them to learn all of this. The story of their roots explains who they are, and they are who they are because of those who came before. It may be a little different for us today. Our culture is very individualistic. We don't live in extended families any longer. Our children grow up and they move out on their own. So our stories are somewhat limited than they used to be. However, my parents did tell me lots of stories about Iowa School for the Deaf. They told me stories every day, and I really appreciated knowing those stories, knowing what my father's childhood was like, what my mother's childhood was like at the residential school for the deaf during that era. So if we all look back at Jesus, the Messiah, if we look at his family, if we trace it all the way back, we see a great deal of diversity. We see a big diversity within his family. I'm not going to talk about each name by any means, but verses 3 through 6 really are full of the best gossip in there. I'm going to tell you the gossip part. And this centered on 4 amazing women. And they were Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, and Bathsheba. Bathsheba, Matthew wrote about Bathsheba. Actually, he did not name her. Matthew used the term Uriah's wife. He didn't use her full name. He did name Tamar, Ruth, and Rahab. And maybe you all remember, Jewish people would not dare to write down a woman's first name. Because in that culture, they looked down on women. But Matthew did, except for Bathsheba. He referred to her as Uriah's wife. So this story really starts in Genesis chapter 38. And that begins with Tamar. Now Tamar's husband had passed. And according to Jewish law, it said that his brother, who was still living, must marry the widow. So Tamar's husband had died. Her father gave her to a brother, but then he died as well. Now, Tamar's father was, the father's name was Judah of the 2 brothers, and he had another son who was very, very young. and said, Tamar, you're going to have to wait till my son grows up and then we can marry you. So she waited until the son got old enough, and then the father changed his mind and said, no, he did not want his youngest son to marry Tamar because maybe Tamar was jinxed. I mean, he'd had 2 sons who were married to her who died, so he decided to not allow the youngest to marry Tamar. Remember, women who did not marry during that time were in danger. They couldn't survive. And Tamar knew that she had to get married again in order to support herself. So she dressed up like a prostitute and stood on the corner and saw Judah, the dad, come, and she just kind of flickered her eyelashes at him and beckoned him, and you know what happened. Yeah, they slept together. So Tamar thought, how could she prove this? Because she was impregnated with twins. When people found out that she was pregnant and unmarried, then they would stone her. That, again, was Jewish law. They were ready to kill Tamar. So she stole Judah's, after they slept together, she took Judah's sash and his ring and his staff. And she kept him until it was time that her pregnant was to be announced, and they were ready to kill her, and then she brought these items out as evidence that Judah had slept with her. And Judah was humiliated. He was he couldn't get out of it. He said, oh yeah, there's the proof. I slept with her, and so it was a mess. It was messy, right? And then Ruth is a little less messy, but she was destitute. Her husband had died. She was Gentile. She was not even Jewish. And she did kind of flirt with a rich guy, an older rich Israelite. That was Boaz. Now Ruth, the shocking thing about her was that she went in to glean the fields. You know, once the harvest is done and then they start to sieve out the wheat from the chaff, she went into that room and she saw Boaz. And she laid with him there. And ended up, and here she was, poor with no husband, you know, and so she was coming and taking the gleanings from the wheat because the perimeter of the fields were supposed to be left for the poor people to come and be able to gather wheat and grain. So, you know, she was in that situation where she was poor, she was gleaning, then she slept with him, then she got married, and then she was rich. It happened in one season, imagine that. And now a third one was Rahab. And you guys remember Rahab, right? She was a real live prostitute. Oops, there go my notes. A real live prostitute. She dressed the part, she worked the part, but she was an awesome strategist. She was an awesome person who could make deals with anybody. And she was also an awesome spy for Israel. And she hid the spies for Israel. So she agreed to hide the Israelite spies so that when they would come into Israel, she agreed that when people were coming into Israel to try and destroy them and take them captive, she agreed that the spies would come in and act as part of her family. So then the Israelites would come in and lay siege to that city. And the only people who survived that siege by the Israelites were Rahab and the people in her household. You know, Rahab is in Jesus' family tree, right? Then the last woman that's significant, it was Bathsheba, the one that Matthew termed Uriah's wife. Well, and that's true. She was the wife of Uriah. But King David saw her one day taking a bath, and he just had to have her. He said, I have got to have this woman to be my wife. So what David did was he ordered Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, to go to the front lines of the battle So Uriah did, and was killed in battle. Then King David was able to bring Bathsheba to him and marry her. And Bathsheba was loyal to King David for many, many years. Through all of King David's challenges, she was there behind the scenes supporting him. You know, she didn't ever perseverate on the fact that King David had plotted to have her husband killed in the war so that he could take her as his wife. So you can see all of those names, and you may have noticed there were parentheses around some of them. It said Ruth, son of, or Ruth, husband, or Uriah, husband of Bathsheba, all this kind of stuff. Matthew wanted us to know about those women, because Matthew wanted us to see that Jesus' family tree is exactly the same as our family trees. Exactly the same. There are a lot of people in everybody's family trees that have bad behavior. Oh, by the way, well, I'm trying to say this, but maybe not. I was going to say most of the bad behavior comes from men, but never mind, because the women exhibited bad behavior too, so it would be both the men and the women had bad behaviors in the biblical stories. But it's important for us to know these women's names, because they were clever and determined, they were industrious, and they kept moving forward at all costs, no matter what they were going through. Just like us today. We're going through hard times. But the people in Jesus' family tree also went through tough times. They didn't have smooth sailing. They didn't have a real peaceful life with plenty of resources. Jesus had the exact same family tree that we do, that were facing challenges upon challenges. And what's cool is that even though Jesus had kind of a messy history, they are still listed in the Holy Bible as Jesus' family, as his lineage. And that's a big deal. You know, it was no secret. Everybody in the first century Jewish culture knew about all those people, and it was documented so that we would know. So that we would know that we are okay. That, yeah, we've got challenges, and that's okay. That we've got family members who are just pretty much in error. Some of them making huge mistakes. Some of us that we just think, wow, how can they even do that? Some of us have family members who are addicts, and that's okay. We have those who are involved in, illicit activities, and that's okay. Matthew shows us that through Jesus' family tree, that Jesus had the exact same kind of family tree that we do. And our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, wanted us to know the stories of those 4 women. And these stories have meaning for us too. They're not just for the Jewish people. These stories are for absolutely everyone who believes. They want us and our children and our children's children and children's children's children to know about these 4 women. One was a prostitute. One was not even Jewish. They had messy lives, replete with errors. You can call them errors or sin, whatever you want to. But they were the same type of things that we have in our family trees. And they are part of our ancestry as well. It's been passed down from generation to generation to generation until we get to Jesus, the Messiah. His family tree looked like ours until we get to who Jesus Christ was born. And maybe Matthew wanted us to see all the folks who led up to Jesus. Maybe he wanted us to see the DNA that Jesus got from them. He truly did. And those were the people that Jesus grew up hearing their stories. his parents were giving him the oral history of who Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were, who Rahab was, who Bathsheba was, who Tamar was. Isn't that cool to think about? Jesus heard those stories growing up. And during Advent, I want to show you the real nativity story during the next 4 weeks. Not the story that just is the beautiful Christmas card, smooth experience of people with plenty of resources that was flawless. No, we want to show you the real nativity story. Jesus wants us to know the truth, the authentic story, so that we can understand that we are so very much more normal than we think we are. Even though our family history has all this stuff with people that kind of make us go, oh my, it's okay. It's just okay. Keep moving forward. And remember that we are valuable, and those ancestors of ours who had the atrocious behavior were valuable too. This story is about a pregnancy out of wedlock. And Joseph was humiliated by that. This story is about a family who was forced to travel because of a census. This is a story about an innkeeper who was not very nice and turned them away, said there was not enough room. Jesus' story is a story of a family who had to flee and become refugees in another country in order to protect the baby Jesus. Matthew wants us to see Jesus' family tree is exactly the same as ours. It's messy, it's challenging, it's hard, it's complex. It includes adultery and divorce and addiction. It's messy. Jesus' family tree is full of courageous women who moved forward regardless of the obstacles that they were facing, no matter how large they were, no matter what situations arose. One of Jesus' names is Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So whenever we sing, O come, Emmanuel, you know that song? O come, Emmanuel. What that means is, come, God, with us. God has always been with us, and God is with us today because God chose to come and be born with us. God did not come through a perfect lineage. God did not come that way. God came through a family just like yours and mine. And that list that Matthew delineates, Matthew wants us to know that Jesus' ancestors also included royalty, King David. So he was a direct descendant of King David's bloodline. And Matthew also wanted us to see that in Jesus' line, it went straight back to Abraham. That he was part of King David's bloodline and Abraham's bloodline. So that he had royalty. And you know the word for genealogy, do you know what the etymology of that is? It's Genesis. That's the Greek word for genealogy. And that can be used for nativity, and what it means. The nativity is the beginning, just like Genesis. The first book of Genesis starts with in the beginning, right? So Matthew wants us to know that when Jesus came, it was a new beginning. The Genesis was the story of light coming into darkness because God commanded it, that life coming out of chaos because God spoke it into being. Creation. When it was complete, God looked and said, this is good. And now, with Jesus' birth, we have a new Genesis, a new beginning. It's a story of light coming into the dark world because God commanded it. It's the story of life coming into a world of chaos because God spoke it. And Jesus was the new creation that God saw and said, this is good. This is the story of Jesus. Jesus who was and Jesus who is, and people still talk about his story. And Jesus is still alive and walking among us. Jesus is still teaching us, still encouraging us, giving us hope when we feel depressed. Jesus is teaching us that love can conquer any disease or hate or enmity. The birth of Jesus, because of the birth of Jesus, new beginnings are possible. Jesus taught us the same things that Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, and Bathsheba taught Jesus. And those lessons Jesus continues to teach us. So if you've got the will, you'll find a way. The people you think are not valuable are truly valuable. And the painful parts of our life do not dictate who we are completely. And it is possible to have a life with purpose, no matter what challenges we face. We can overcome them. Jesus is someone who was born into a messy world, who had a messy family tree, who had some messy stories, and he saw mess in humanity. But this Advent time, we want the manger to beckon us, to draw us in, to call us to come so that we can move closer and closer to Jesus and see that Jesus is exactly the same as we are. In our mess and in our brokenness, Jesus says, come, here I am. I came to be with you as you are, as I am. Amen and amen. Let's pray.